Hey there, Psych 370 students, and welcome to your fifth and final video lecture for week 14. This is going to be a pretty brief one, and in it, I'm going to be focusing on the last section of your reading assignment for this week, the last section of Chapter 9 of the textbook, which describes several interesting ways that operant conditioning can be applied to improve the quality of life for captive animals, such as those in zoos. So, for example, one of those applications that the chapter discusses has to do with figuring out a way to trim the calluses that had built up on the feet of an aggressive elephant. So, apparently, if you don't do that for an elephant, then the calluses can get so bad that the elephant becomes unable to walk. But for one particular elephant at the San Diego Zoo, the trainers had a hard time coming up with a way to trim those calluses safely because the elephant's history of aggressive behavior made them reluctant to enter its pen. And so instead, what they did was they built a steel gate that had a hole in it. And the plan was for the elephant to put its foot through that hole so that a veterinarian could trim its calluses while remaining safely on the other side of the gate. But the problem, of course, was getting the elephant to cooperate with this plan. So, to train the elephant to stick its foot through the hole, the behavior specialists at the zoo used shaping. They just reinforced the elephant for successive approximations of this desired behavior. So they reinforced it first for just standing in front of the hole. Once it was doing that, they reinforced it for lifting its foot off of the ground. Then they reinforced it for raising its foot a little higher, then for moving its foot toward the hole, and so on until the elephant would voluntarily walk over to the hole, put its foot in there, and hold it there while it got this little pedicure. So it's a pretty interesting example of shaping in action, and it's yet another example of how operant conditioning can be used to solve a practical problem. But another problem that zookeepers face is basically that when animals are held in captivity, they often act kind of bored. So, for example, they might pace up and down, they might groom themselves excessively. So, they engage in what we call stereotypic behaviors, which are these repetitive behaviors that don't seem to serve any apparent purpose. And we don't usually see stereotypic behaviors in wild animals, but we do in captive animals, and they're often taken as indicators of poor psychological well being in those animals. Now, one reason that these stereotypic behaviors may occur in captive animals could be that the environment they're living in is deficient. It just doesn't provide them with enough things to do. So, for example, whereas wild animals have to search for their food, such as by foraging, captive animals typically have their food provided for them, right? So they don't have to do anything to obtain it. And like I said, these animals often act like they're bored. So, one way to treat that boredom seems to be to make obtaining food a more effortful process for these animals. For example, the book describes the story of a bear whose food would be hidden throughout its enclosure, meaning that it would have to spend a good chunk of its day looking for that food. And that's more similar to what it would have to do in the wild, right? So, in other words, before this was done, the bear didn't really have a reason to be active. It had its food provided for it, and even if it did go looking for food, those efforts were unlikely to be reinforced with food. But now that the food was scattered and hidden around its enclosure, the bear became more active because that higher activity level now had reinforcing consequences. It resulted in food. And as a result of having to look for their food like that, captive animals do typically become less bored, as indicated by a decrease in their stereotypic behaviors. Now, of course, with those examples, we're talking about using operant conditioning to improve the quality of the animals' lives. But while we're covering these applications to animal behavior, I also want to show you one last video here, which is about how operant techniques with animals can be used to improve human lives too.
Operant conditioning has been applied in several settings beyond the research laboratories where it was first discovered.
These are not mechanical devices. These are dogs. That means that they don't always do everything perfectly every time.
This promotional film shows a San Diego training program called Canines for Independence. Using behavioral principles, these dogs have learned to assist in the care of disabled patients. Desired behaviors are reinforced by means of operant conditioning until the dog learns a new routine in which a complex sequence of responses are chained together.
So I got him to jump up on the table, and it took me about 3 or 4 times telling me what I wanted. And then he got it and handed it to me. And now he just does it all the time. It is just one command for him to get it. Now I don't have
The
to go
dogs
get
learn to retrieve objects. They learn to pull wheelchairs and even push elevator buttons.
Atta boy. Good boy. I didn't know it was going to be like this when I first started, but after I went through it, it's all come true. After learning all these commands, everything that I've learned, it's working. It's all working.
Okay, so guys, like I said in my first video lecture for this week, there are way too many applications of operant conditioning out there for us to cover all of them in 1 week of this course or 1 chapter of a textbook. But one thing that I hope you take away from this week of the course is that despite the fact that these principles were developed largely on the basis of research with rats and pigeons in Skinner boxes, they can still be applied to many different real-world problems in many different settings. So kind of like I told you when we covered the applications of classical conditioning, knowing about how operant conditioning works and the variables that affect it is also really valuable knowledge to have because it can be put to use in a lot of different ways. Okay, well, that's a wrap for this week's video lectures. As always, please let me know if you have any questions about this stuff. Make sure that you get this week's quiz and this week's activity done and submitted in Canvas before the end of the day on Sunday. And I hope you have a good one. Take care, guys.